Chapter 8. Headmistress Minerva McGonagall poured herself a cup of tea and then sat down to enjoy it. It had been a busy first week at Hogwarts, and a rather successful one at that. Student interest in the new potions contest seemed to be fairly high, and things were all running smoothly. There came a soft knock at the door. Who could that be? Surely there weren't any problems this early in the school year. Last year there had been that late admission of Miss Wycliffe, Holly, but the odds of something like that happening 2 years in a row were quite, well, perhaps it would be best to stop speculating and see who it was. "Come in," said Minerva. The door opened to reveal Professor Lovegood and Miss Wycliffe. Luna was carrying an insect cage of some sort, and Holly looked distinctly uncomfortable. Holly looked even more like Lily Evans this year, if that was possible. Minerva sometimes had a hard time thinking of her as someone other than Miss Evans. "I was just going to have some tea," said Minerva to put them at ease. "Would you two like to join me?" "Yes, please," said Luna. Using her wand, Minerva conjured up some more cups and 2 more chairs. "Have a seat," she told them. The 2 of them sat down and waited until she had poured them each a cup of tea. "Now," said Minerva, "why don't you tell me what's on your mind?" Holly looked at Luna, and Luna looked back at her before speaking. "We have a puzzle we're hoping you can help us with," said Luna finally. "A puzzle?" said Minerva. "What sort of puzzle?" Luna was a Ravenclaw. There were few puzzles she could not solve on her own. "It concerns this grasshopper," said Luna, placing the insect cage on the desk between them. "Oh?" said Minerva. She picked up the cage and looked at the grasshopper within curiously. It seemed to be a fairly large grasshopper with faint pink and white markings. "What about it?" "It is most unusual," continued Luna, looking at it also from the other side through her oversized glasses. Minerva turned the cage around curiously and studied the grasshopper from all angles. It looked like a regular grasshopper to her, maybe a bit large. Minerva was no expert, but the coloring did seem unusual for a grasshopper. However, she suspected that was not why they had brought it to her. "In what way?" she asked, setting the cage back down. It was best to let them explain things before jumping to conclusions. "Well," said Luna, "Miss Wycliffe here thinks it may not be a grasshopper." Minerva turned her attention to Holly. "Really?" she asked Holly, peering at her through her square-framed glasses. "Well, maybe," replied Holly uncertainly, not looking at Minerva directly. "I mean, it just isn't quite right as a grasshopper." "What do you think it is?" Minerva asked her curiously, returning her attention to the grasshopper. "I think," began Holly timidly. Then she gathered up some more courage. "I think it's a person that's been turned into a grasshopper," she blurted. "Oh?" said Minerva, concealing the surprise she felt at Holly's words. It was a very unusual conclusion. "Why would you say that?" "Well," began Holly nervously, "it's very large, larger than any other grasshopper I've ever seen, and its markings," she added quickly. "Susan's never seen any grasshopper with those particular markings before, and she really knows her grasshoppers. But mostly," Holly concluded, "because it has emotions like a person. I've never felt the emotions of an insect before. I'm not sure empaths can," she finished lamely. Minerva turned to Luna. "What do you think?" she asked, though she already knew the answer, since they were visiting her. "I think," began Luna slowly in her musical voice, "that Miss Wycliffe has had a year or more of observing human emotions. Who better to recognize a human in any form?" "Is there some sort of spell we can use to see if it's a person?" asked Holly anxiously. "She's been getting a lot weaker." "She?" questioned Minerva. "Yes, ma'am," replied Holly more confidently. "It's definitely a she." "Well," said Minerva thoughtfully, "let's see what we can find out." She drew out her wand. "If you would all stand behind me, please," she suggested. Luna and Holly stood and moved behind Minerva. Then Minerva pointed her wand at the top of a wall beyond the cage. "Hominium revelio," she commanded. The tip of the wand did nothing. Minerva gently moved the wand around the room, gradually aiming it lower and lower, until it pointed at the cage and the grasshopper within. The grasshopper stirred, and the tip of the wand turned a greenish color. The green color faded completely when Minerva moved the wand away from the cage. Minerva put her wand away. "That settles it," she told the others. "However improbable, That grasshopper is actually human." Minerva walked up to the cage and studied the grasshopper again. "At this point," she said thoughtfully, "I would normally contact the Department of Spell Reversals at the Ministry of Magic, but I believe you're right, Miss Wycliffe. It does look weaker. We may not have the time to go through proper channels." Luna removed her glasses and tucked them into her robe. Then she moved up and stared more closely at the grasshopper with her silvery eyes. "Incantatus reversalis?" she suggested softly. "I think not," replied Minerva. "We don't know that an incantation was used to do this, and if we're wrong—" She quickly reviewed in her mind the spells she knew that might work. "Perhaps spellicious annullium," she said finally. "If you would be so good to assist." Luna nodded, drew out her own wand, and held it ready. The two backed away from the cage. "On the count of 3, commanded Minerva. "Ready?" she asked, drawing her own wand and aiming it at the cage. "Ready," replied Luna. "Miss Wycliffe," said Minerva, glancing in her direction, "would you please release the grasshopper?" Holly nodded. She walked forward, opened the cage, reached inside, and carefully removed the grasshopper. She placed it gently on the desk and stepped quickly away. The grasshopper moved about feebly. Minerva called out, "1, 2." The grasshopper stretched its wings and rose up from the desk. "3! Spellicious annullium!" Both spells hit the grasshopper simultaneously. It vanished from sight in a flash of purple light and a haze of smoke. There came the sound of a loud thwunk, and when the smoke cleared, a huge, dirty, pink form lay with legs bent and arms stretched out on the desk. All 3 moved closer to look. "It's a child," said Minerva in wonderment. Despite magical proof to the contrary, she hadn't really believed that the grasshopper could actually be a person. "And a very small child at that," added Luna softly. At the sound of their voices, the little girl waved her arms feebly and began to make soft, moaning sounds. She had short brown hair. She wore a dirty pink nightgown and dirty white slippers of some sort. "Miss Wycliffe," said Minerva briskly, "I believe we are in need of your services." Minerva was well aware of how Holly had helped the Timmins child at St. Mungle's. Between Mrs. Timmins and Stan, who could be a bit of a gossip at times, practically the whole adult wizard community knew what the Potter cousin had done. Minerva hadn't heard a word about it from anyone at Hogwarts, though. Like Harry Potter, Holly did not seem to be one to boast or brag. "What?" said Holly. She'd been staring down at the girl, too. "Oh, right." She closed her eyes and appeared to concentrate. After a few minutes she began to speak in a very professional manner. "Scared, very disoriented, cold." At this point Luna pulled off her robe. She gently folded the girl's arms and wrapped the robe tenderly around the child. "There," whispered Luna in the girl's ear. "Is that better?" The child opened her eyes and stared at Luna. "Very thirsty and hungry," continued Miss Wycliffe. That part was very obvious. The child was painfully thin. "Would you like some hot cocoa?" asked Luna softly. Wordlessly, the child nodded. Luna pulled out her wand and waved it. Almost immediately a cup of steaming hot cocoa appeared on the desk next to the child. But instead of taking the cup, the girl squinched her eyes shut, curled up in the desk even tighter, and made loud moaning sounds. "A Muggle child," concluded Minerva in disbelief. "How could a Muggle child end up at Hogwarts?" Holly stepped forward, knelt down, and took the girl's hand. "It's okay," she said to the girl soothingly. "These people are friends. They're here to help you. Everything's going to be all right." She looked up at Minerva. "There's no broken bones or anything. Mostly it's fear, confusion, thirst, and hunger. But she's terribly weak." "Then we need to get her to the infirmary immediately," said Luna. "I agree," said Minerva. "Professor Lovegood, would you be so good as to take her down there?" Luna nodded, scooping the girl off the desk. The child clung onto Holly's hand even tighter. Noting this, Minerva added, "Miss Wycliffe, I'd like you to please go with Professor Lovegood and stay with the girl in the infirmary. We may have further need of your special abilities. I'll notify Professor Iverson of your whereabouts, so no one will worry. Meanwhile, I need to contact the ministry about this." "You're going to the hospital," whispered Holly to the girl when they walked out of Headmistress McGonagall's office. "It's going to be okay," she repeated again reassuringly. "We're all friends here. Holly knew the girl had become more frightened when Professor Lovegood picked her up and started moving her. They made their way down the stairs, through the corridors, and towards the infirmary. Students looked at them curiously as they passed. All the while, Holly kept a firm grip on the child's hand and kept on whispering, "It's going to be okay. You're safe now." Madame Pomfrey looked up when they entered the infirmary. "What have we here?" she inquired, immediately becoming businesslike. "She's a muggle," said Professor Lovegood bluntly. "Oh," said Madame Pomfrey knowingly. "Put her there," she said briskly, pointing to a bed in the corner. "Miss Wycliffe," she added, "why don't you stay with her while we talk?" Holly nodded. She grabbed a chair with her free hand as they walked and brought it with her to the bed. Professor Lovegood set the girl gently on the bed and then moved away. Madame Pomfrey swiftly slid a curtain around both Holly and the bed, hiding them from the rest of the infirmary. Holly scooted her chair next to the bed and sat down beside the girl, all the while holding her hand. The room became very quiet. Holly suspected they were using a muffliato spell so they wouldn't be overheard. Focusing her attention on the girl, Holly gently removed Professor Lovegood's robe and pulled up a blanket. Then she rubbed the girl's arms and legs a bit to warm her up. When she looked at the face, she saw the girl's eyes were again open. The girl was watching her. "Hello," said Holly softly to the child. "Would you like some water?" Of course she would. Holly knew the girl's throat felt rough and dry. Holly pointed to the pitcher of water nearby and gently released her hand from the girl's grip. "I'm not going anywhere," she assured the girl, noting the instant rise in fear. "I'm just getting some water, and I need both hands." Holly poured out the water and returned to the girl. Then Holly lifted the girl's shoulder up and held the glass so she could take a sip. The drink made the girl feel much better. She was beginning to warm up, and some of the disorientation was gone. Holly didn't know what else she could or should do. "My name's Holly," she told the girl. "What's yours?" The girl's voice sounded raw and scratchy. She tried again. "Egg," she finally croaked in a whisper. "It's okay. You don't have to speak," reassured Holly. She could tell it hurt for the girl to talk. "Is your name Meg?" The girl nodded her head, just a fraction. "That's a pretty name. Would you like some more water?" Meg nodded her head again, watching her with wide eyes all the while. Holly brought the glass again to Meg's lips for a second drink. Then the curtain swept open, and Madame Pomfrey entered, carrying a tray with a small bowl of soup and a spoon. "My name is Madame Pomfrey," she said, smiling. "I'm a nurse," she explained. "I'm here to help you get better. Would you like some chicken soup?" Meg nodded her head slightly. "Good," said Madame Pomfrey, setting down the tray. "A bit of food is just what you need right now. Miss Wycliffe, would you help?" "Yes, ma'am." Madame Pomfrey popped some pillows beneath Meg's head and shoulders. Holly held the bowl and picked up the spoon. "If it's too warm," directed Madame Pomfrey in a low voice, "turn it counterclockwise." Holly nodded. She checked the temperature of the soup and gave it a few stirs before filling the spoon. "Not too much or too fast, mind you," commanded Madame Pomfrey, "or she'll spit it up. The stomach does funny things when it's been without food for a while." Holly spooned some of the soup into Meg's mouth. She could feel the sensation of warmth flowing down Meg's throat. It felt good. She gave Meg another spoonful, and another. When she had finished the bowl, Holly looked up at Madame Pomfrey. "All done?" Madame Pomfrey asked. Holly nodded. "Good. I expect you're feeling a bit tired now, aren't you?" said Madame Pomfrey, addressing Meg. Holly nodded, along with Meg. Meg was feeling much better, not so hungry, less scared, warmer, and very drowsy. "Then I want you to lay back and get some rest. Sleep is the best thing for you after a very scary day." She tucked the blanket around Meg and vanished behind the curtain. Holly sat back in her chair and waited for Meg to fall asleep. When Meg was soundly asleep, Holly slipped out of her chair and went outside the curtains to see Madame Pomfrey. Madame Pomfrey noted her arrival with approval. "She asleep?" Holly nodded. "Yes, ma'am," she replied softly. "Good," said Madame Pomfrey. "Now, when a muggle is involved, we like to keep wizard contact to a minimum. It's a good thing the infirmary is empty right now. I've already contacted Healer Winonan, and he is confident that between you and me, we can take care of the child's needs so she won't have to be transferred to St. Mungle's. The girl seems to trust you, Miss Wycliffe, so I want you to stay here with her. I've already asked that your things be brought here from the dorms." "My cat?" "An excellent idea," continued Madame Pomfrey. "Little girls and cats go well together. I'll make sure Sasha comes down to join you, too. Now, when she wakes up, try to find out whatever you can about her. Her name, where she lives, what happened." "Her name is Meg," interrupted Holly. "Meg? Excellent. I'll pass that on to the ministry. You told Professor Lovegood that you sensed her on the Hogwarts Express from London. Is that true?" "Yes, ma'am, I think so." "I'll pass that on, too. That means whatever happened to Meg occurred at least a week ago or more. The ministry will search the London Muggle News for a child named Meg that might have gone missing about that time. A ministry representative will be by later. In the meantime, you keep Meg calm and occupied. We don't want to distress her any more. The poor thing's already been through enough." Holly nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Oh," continued Madame Pomfrey, "Professor Lovegood dropped by your bag. I happened to notice a boorish potions book among your things." Holly nodded again, blushing a bit. "I thought I might see what potions I could brew." Her voice trailed off, embarrassed. After all, she was only a second-year student and didn't know much yet. "Good," said Madame Pomfrey approvingly. "Making potions is an excellent way to learn more about potions and what they can do." She turned to a cabinet and pulled some books off the shelf. "You might find these useful," she said, handing them to Holly. "Thank you," said Holly, taking the books eagerly. She settled down in a chair and began to read, while waiting for Meg to wake up. Becky and Mark joined Holly for dinner after promising to leave the first sign Meg showed of waking up. The whole school was buzzing with the news about the little girl Holly had found. Sometimes it was hard to keep secrets at Hogwarts. "What do you think happened?" asked Mark, taking a bite of stew. "How do you think she got here?" asked Becky, piling some seconds onto her plate. "You sure she was on the train?" "Yes," said Holly. She took a sip of milk before continuing. "But I'm pretty sure she was already a grasshopper then, because I'm certain if I'd seen her I would have remembered." "That's something," said Mark. "I'd hate to think any of the students had done this." Holly nodded. "The name Meg," she said musingly. "It sounds familiar somehow, but I just can't place it." Meg woke later that evening. Holly was waiting with more soup and drink to tempt her. Healer Winona had advised that food and rest would be the best things for Meg. By this time, Madame Pomfrey had reported the wizards could find no record of a missing Muggle girl in London. They were now widening their search to the area surrounding London, convinced someone somewhere was missing her. Meg was feeling much stronger and actually able to feed herself a bit. But the effort tired her so, Holly encouraged Meg to go back to sleep. Meg did so to the sound of a soothing purr from Sasha. Sasha had jumped onto the bed and snuggled next to Meg while she was eating. Meg smiled in delight at Sasha's presence and immediately stretched out a dirty hand to stroke her. Healer Winona had instructed Holly and Madame Pomfrey to not change Meg's clothes or wash her. Anything out of the expected ordinary in Meg's appearance might confuse the Muggles seeing Meg upon her return. They planned to return Meg just as soon as they could figure out where she belonged. When she tired of reading, Holly curled up on the bed next to Meg and went to sleep, dreaming of fancy potions and little girls with grasshopper wings. When Holly woke the next morning, she sensed a new emotion on the other side of the curtain. She went outside and saw a rather small, plain-looking man with light brown hair, wearing drab gray robes, sharing a meal with Madame Pomfrey. "This is Mr. John Tuttle," said Madame Pomfrey to Holly. "He's an obliviator from the Office of Misinformation. And this is Miss Wycliffe," she said to Mr. Tuttle. Mr. Tuttle smiled warmly. "So this is the young lady that has caused so much excitement in my office." He stood and offered Holly his hand. "Well done," he said, shaking her hand. "I am very pleased to meet you. Won't you join us for some breakfast?" He pulled out his wand and caused a third chair to slide up to the table. Holly sat down. A third plate appeared on the table. While Holly ate, Mr. Tuttle rummaged around beneath his robes and pulled out a Muggle newspaper. "Tell me," he asked casually, holding the newspaper out to her, "is this the little girl you found?" Holly looked at the newspaper that bore a bold headline stating, "Still missing. Search continues." Beneath was a photo of a now familiar little girl with a caption that read, "4-year-old Megan Fielding, last seen August 30." Holly remembered now. She had heard about the abduction over the radio the day she left for London. "Yes, sir, it is," she replied, handing the newspaper back to Mr. Tuttle. The smile widened. "Excellent," he said, returning the newspaper to his pocket. "We'd like to find out exactly what happened to Meg before we return her to her family." He poured himself a cup of tea and took a sip. "This is a very unusual situation," he continued, placing the cup down. We're fairly certain none of us did the actual abduction, as the Muggles found a vehicle that they think the kidnapper used. We don't use such things, Mr. Tuttle explained. So what happened to the kidnapper or kidnappers? More importantly, how did Meg happen to be transformed into a grasshopper? Mr. Tuttle paused and took another sip of tea. When Meg wakens, he directed, Madame Pomfrey will bring her some breakfast. While she's eating, I want you to speak with her. If you think she's strong enough to talk, then tell her a detective wants to see her. That's me. I'll come in and ask her some questions about what happened. I want you to remain, though. She may respond better while you're with her. If we're lucky, we'll find out who did this to her. Holly suddenly turned her head towards the curtain and the bed beyond. Meg's waking, Holly said. Mr. Tuttle pulled off his gray robe, revealing a very ordinary plain brown Muggle-type suit beneath. Go to her, he directed. He waved his wand at the food tray, and it instantly refilled with breakfast foods. Bring her the food, too, he added. Then let's see if we can find some answers. Holly took the tray and walked behind the curtain. Meg was just rubbing her eyes. Sasha had been lying at the foot of Meg's bed. She stood, stretched, and pushed herself underneath Meg's hand in a bid for attention. Absently, Meg began to stroke the cat while she looked around. How are you feeling? Asked Holly. Would you like some food? She sensed Meg didn't feel too hungry, so she set the tray of food on the table next to Meg's head. I think my cat is hungry, don't you? She added conversationally. Holly took one of the small plates and put some scrambled eggs on it for Sasha. Then she set the plate down on the end of the bed. Sasha hurried over and began eating, purring loudly the whole time. Meg pushed herself up in a sitting position to watch. When Sasha finished, she plopped down in Meg's lap and began to clean herself. Meg smiled. Would you like some eggs or cereal? Asked Holly, knowing Meg was feeling hungrier now. Real, said Meg softly. Her voice was still scratchy, but Holly could tell the throat felt much better than last night. Would you like some milk with that? Meg nodded and watched as Holly poured the milk into a dish with the cereal. Do you get cereal at home? Asked Holly, setting the bowl and a spoon down in front of Meg. Meg nodded and began to eat. When Meg finished, Holly removed the bowl and asked, Do you think you could answer some questions? Meg looked at Holly, not responding, but not refusing. There's a man here, continued Holly. He's like a Bobby, she explained. He wants to know what happened so he can make sure it never happens again. Holly could feel fear begin to rise in Meg, so she added, I know the last few days have been really scary for you, but I also know if you tell somebody about it, it won't feel so scary afterwards. She let Meg think about that, and then Holly asked, Would you like to meet him? Ever so slowly, Meg nodded. Holly got up and pulled back the curtain. You can come in now, she said. Mr. Tuttle walked in carrying a red rose and bringing his own chair. Meg, said Holly, this is Detective John Tuttle. He's the Bobby I was telling you about. I am pleased to meet you, said Mr. Tuttle. He reached out, took Meg's hand in his, and gave it a courtly kiss. Meg gave a shy smile, pleased at being treated like an adult. This is for you, continued Mr. Tuttle, handing Meg the rose. Meg took a sniff from the rose and giggled. Holly picked up the rose and sniffed it suspiciously. She found herself smiling, too. She looked inside and noted some blue-colored dust inside. Tickle plant pollen, she thought to herself. No wonder she was smiling. But it did its trick, relaxing Meg and making her more comfortable around Mr. Tuttle. Do you remember the last time your mum tucked you in? He asked gently. Meg nodded. Sometime after that you woke up, added Mr. Tuttle. Do you remember that? Meg nodded again. Why did you wake up? Cold, she said softly. You were cold? That's good. Do you remember where you were when you woke? He asked. Car, she finally said. You were in a car? He asked. Meg nodded. Was it moving? Meg shook her head slowly. Did you see the person driving it? Meg shook her head. Why not? Asked Mr. Tuttle. Dark, she finally said. Was there something over your head? Meg shook her head again. Was it dark everywhere? Meg nodded. Yes, of course. It would have been dark outside, agreed Mr. Tuttle. It was night time, or very early in the morning. That is very good of you to remember. What happened next? The person made you feel scared, didn't he? Interrupted Holly, guessing. She could sense rising fear in Meg. It's okay, she added soothingly. He's not here. You're safe now. Why were you scared? Asked Mr. Tuttle. Words, whispered Meg, her eyes wide. Words? Asked Mr. Tuttle. Meg nodded. What about them? Bad, she replied, her eyes very wide with fear. Bad words? Asked Mr. Tuttle. Was someone saying bad words? Meg nodded. Was the person angry? Meg nodded again. Do you know who it was? Meg shook her head. Was it a man or a woman? Anne. Man? Said Mr. Tuttle. You definitely heard a man's voice? Meg nodded. Was there more than one person? Meg shook her head slowly. What did you do next? Out, said Meg. You got out, clarified Mr. Tuttle, trying to discern the meaning behind her brief words. Meg nodded. Was the car door open, or did you open it? Pin, came the reply. It was open, confirmed Mr. Tuttle carefully, and you got out, right? Meg nodded again. Then what? Ran, said Meg. It's okay, repeated Holly softly, reaching for Meg's hand. It's going to be all right. She could feel a quickening in her own breath and her own panic level rising as Meg talked. You were scared, so you ran, of course, said Mr. Tuttle soothingly. That was a very smart thing to do. Did the man come after you? Meg nodded tearfully and gulped. Then what happened? He asked softly. Meg suddenly smiled. Toy shop. What? Toy shop, Meg continued smiling. You saw a toy shop? Asked Mr. Tuttle, confused. Santa's, added Meg with a smile. You're saying you saw Santa's toy shop while you were being chased by that man, right? Restated Mr. Tuttle in disbelief. Meg nodded again. What happened next? He asked, not knowing what else to say. Santa's toy shop was clearly an unexpected response. Hid. You hid, confirmed Mr. Tuttle. Meg nodded, that smile still on her face. Of course you hid. Where? King. King? Stocking? Meg nodded. What stocking? Asked Mr. Tuttle, hiding his confusion. Christmas King. A Christmas stocking? Asked Mr. Tuttle. He kept his face straight and the expression on his face totally calm, but Holly could sense Mr. Tuttle's total bewilderment at Meg's words. Her answer seemed to make no sense to him at all. Uh-huh, Meg nodded again. Then what? Hurt. Meg started to cry, remembering. It's okay, assured Holly. You're okay. You don't hurt now. She reached up with her free hand and wiped away the tears. When Meg's tears subsided, Mr. Tuttle resumed his questions. Something happened to make you hurt, correct? Meg nodded, sniffing. What happened? He asked gently. Don't know. Dark. You couldn't see? Meg nodded. Was it all dark? Meg shook her head. Funny. Everything looked funny? Meg nodded. Were you still in the stocking? Meg shook her head. Got out, she replied. What did you see? Big toys, she whispered, her eyes ever so wide. Everywhere. Lots and lots. It's all right now, said Holly reassuringly. She could feel the fear rising again in Meg. Go on, encouraged Mr. Tuttle gently. Legs. Meg broke off, too upset. What about your legs? Asked Mr. Tuttle. Didn't work. Meg's eyes again filled with tears. It's okay, soothed Holly. Meg was feeling really confused and scared. Holly felt really confused and scared. It was like she was reliving the experience with Meg all over again. I know you were really scared, Holly added, trying to separate her feelings from Meg's, but everything is all right now. You're doing real good, said Mr. Tuttle encouragingly. Why don't we back up a bit to something not so scary? Remember when you said you woke up and felt cold? Meg sniffed and nodded. Did you feel anything else? Did your head hurt or anything? Yes, replied Meg in a small voice. How about your throat? Did it hurt too? Meg nodded. Santa's toy shop, continued Mr. Tuttle. How did you know it was his shop? Bench and toys and presents? What about people? Did you see anyone? Any elves, perhaps? No, Meg whispered while shaking her head. Are you sure no one else was there? Yes, she said, nodding. Mr. Tuttle hid it well, but Holly could tell the answer disappointed him. What color was the Christmas stocking? He asked. Red and white. Did you hear anything after you got in the stocking? No. I know you hurt, he said softly, but did you feel anything else? Sick, she whispered. A lot sick. Did you throw up? Meg shook her head, her eyes glistening with tears. Did you want to? Meg nodded. Tears started streaming down her face. Holly hugged Meg tight and rocked her. It's going to be okay, she assured Meg. It's all going to be okay. Can you remember anything else before you got into the Christmas stocking? No, whispered Meg, sobbing softly. She clung to Holly as she cried. Holly could feel the tears well up inside herself. Mr. Tuttle straightened and leaned back in the chair. Thank you very much, he said. You've been a big help, he assured Meg solemnly. Holly could tell Mr. Tuttle was actually disappointed. Meg hadn't been as much help as he had hoped. Here, he said, smiling cheerfully. He pulled something brown and tan out of a bag. It's a reward for being so very brave and helpful. It's candy. He handed two to Meg, another to Holly, and popped a fourth into his own mouth. They're kind of sweet, he continued, while Holly and Meg examined what he had given them. They looked a lot like ordinary brown mushrooms. But, he continued, I figure it's okay as you've already had your breakfast. Holly cautiously took a bite. The mushroom tasted nearly like pure sugar. Meg took a small bite and then rapidly finished off both her mushrooms. More? She asked hopefully, savoring the sweet taste. She used her dirty sleeve and wiped the tears off her face. Mr. Tuttle smiled. Maybe later, he replied, handing the bag to Holly. Perhaps you could talk Holly into a few more pieces after dinner. I've got to go now, he added, standing up. Thank you so much for talking with me. I'll be back later after we've made arrangements to take you home. Your Mummy and Daddy miss you a whole lot. Meg smiled at that. Miss Wycliffe, he added, while grabbing the chair he had brought, perhaps you could help and bring that breakfast tray. Holly nodded and stood up herself. Why don't you play with Sasha a while, she suggested to Meg. I'll be back in a few minutes, Holly assured, calming the sense of rising concern she felt for Meg. Then she followed Mr. Tuttle out. Once outside, Holly handed the tray to Madame Pomfrey. Mr. Tuttle pulled out his wand and whispered Muffliotto. Then he turned to Holly and asked, was she telling the truth about the Santa toy shop? What? Yes, she replied. And there was nobody around when she was there? Not as far as Meg noticed. She was alone, confirmed Holly. Why? There is no Santa toy shop in the area where they found the car. There are no stores at all, said Mr. Tuttle. But she wasn't lying, protested Holly. There must be something. I know that's what she thinks she saw, he continued, but reality is another matter. I was hoping the child could shed some light on the situation, Mr. Tuttle added, but she has made it more confusing than ever. Remember when I asked her about waking up? Yes. Well, the headache and scratchy throat are signs that the kidnapper may have drugged Meg when he took her. Probably not enough, Mr. Tuttle concluded, which is why she woke when she did. But it was still enough. Meg could have been suffering from the effects of whatever drug the kidnapper gave her when she ran. The child was probably hallucinating the whole time. Muggle drugs can do that. It gets us to know closer on how she happened to be turned into a grasshopper. Do you really think a wizard did it? Asked Madame Pomfrey. Had to be, replied Mr. Tuttle. Who else? But I just don't see how or why. According to Meg and what we already know, he began, she's running away from a kidnapper and ran into someone able to make transformations. What are the odds of that? Making transformations of this kind is not something any wizard can do on a whim. But for some reason, this wizard transforms Meg into a grasshopper and takes her to London. The child couldn't have gotten to London on her own, he explained. She would have been too disoriented from the transformation, and London's too far away. But why? Mr. Tuttle continued, frowning. And why release her on the express afterwards? None of this makes any sense at all. Mr. Tuttle sighed. He looked at Holly. You sure she didn't have anything else to add? No, nothing, she replied. Well, ask again later and see if she remembers anything else. And be sure you give her some more of these mushrooms. Why? Meg's disappearance generated a lot of Muggle publicity, explained Mr. Tuttle. Her safe return is likely to create as much, if not more, publicity. There will, no doubt, be questions about what happened. Questions we'd rather not have her answer, would prefer she not be asked in the first place. The easiest way to avoid embarrassing questions is to return Megan to the area near where they last think she was located, and make sure a responsible muggle find her. If the muggles believe she spent the last week wandering around in the woods, lost and scared, they won't think to ask questions about trains and wizard schools. But what does that have to do with candy mushrooms? Asked Holly. Some mushrooms, when eaten, cause muggles to hallucinate, he explained. When the child tells them she ate mushrooms, the muggles will attribute any unbelievable parts of her story, such as Christmas stockings, to the effects of the mushrooms she ate. We've safely returned many a lost muggle hiker that way, he added. Modifying muggle memories is a tricky business, and I'd like to leave as many of her original memories in place if possible. We will, of course, make sure the child forgets anything about the transformation, us, and the infirmary. Those memories would be too strong and too normal to attribute to mushrooms. Also, he added, I want you to try to get her to walk around a bit. But she's so weak, protested Holly. I know, agreed Mr. Tuttle, but do what you can. It takes a different set of muscles to move as a grasshopper. The child may have to relearn walking. It should be okay for her to move about in the infirmary as long as you keep her away from the windows. We'd like Meg to return to her family in as normal a physical condition as possible. Okay, agreed Holly. I'll try. Good girl, replied Mr. Tuttle with a smile. I'll be back tonight after we've made arrangements for her return. With that, he left the infirmary. Holly went back to check on Meg. She was playing quietly with Sasha, who was happily batting the edge of the blanket that Meg wiggled for her. Holly spent the rest of the day with Meg. They played with Sasha, and Meg walked around the infirmary a bit. Mr. Tuttle was right. Meg did experience difficulty walking at first, but she remembered how soon enough. After lunch, Holly gave Meg some more candy mushrooms, and, feeling Meg was tired, insisted she nap a bit. Mr. Tuttle returned after dinner. Holly stood back with Madame Pomfrey and watched as Mr. Tuttle lit a candle in front of Meg. It had a weird bluish light and gave off a yellow smoke. It put Meg into some sort of a trance. Mr. Tuttle had her saying some words, recounting memories, and then his wand would glow while he softly said, "Obliviate." Holly heard Meg describe the infirmary, Madame Pomfrey, Mr. Tuttle. Is this what they usually do to modify memories? Holly asked Madame Pomfrey while Mr. Tuttle worked. She didn't want to hear memories of herself removed. Actually, this is a special children's memory charm, replied Madame Pomfrey. It's fairly easy to modify an adult's memory. They usually don't want to believe in giants or dragons anyway. But children have active imaginations. A poorly done modification could result in stifling their mental development. In this case, Mr. Tuttle has to leave Meg's memories of the kidnapping intact for the Muggle authorities. He's removing the Santa's toy shop, as that doesn't fit with the story we want Meg to tell of wandering around lost in the woods. Mr. Tuttle is also adding some more woods and tree memories to help account for all those missing days. You can't get everything without totally destroying her memory. Hopefully, the bits and pieces remaining that surface will be attributed to the drugs the kidnapper gave her or the mushrooms she ate. Suddenly, Meg closed her eyes and slumped backwards to be caught by Mr. Tuttle, who gently laid her back on the bed. He stood and stretched a bit. "That's done," he said simply. "What's next?" asked Holly when Mr. Tuttle left Meg's side. "Next," replied Mr. Tuttle, "we take Meg back to the area where they think she was lost. They're still searching for her," he added. "We've got to look at the map marking the places they plan to search tomorrow. We'll set Meg down in that area and make sure she's found by one of the searchers." "I want to go too," said Holly abruptly. "That's not necessary," said Mr. Tuttle. "You've done your part. Now it's time for us to do our job." "Please," begged Holly. "I have to go. What if something happens before they find her?" "She'll be fine," assured Mr. Tuttle. "We know what we're doing. We'll keep a good watch over her. Don't worry." "Mr. Tuttle," began Holly, trying again, "I've been living Meg's emotions for the past 2 days, and there is such an emptiness inside me I can't begin to describe. I promised Meg everything would be okay. I have to go along to make sure. I need to go." "Miss Wycliffe has spent a lot of time with Meg," said Madame Pomfrey. "If it means that much to her, surely she could come." "No offense," objected Mr. Tuttle, "but she's not an obliviator. This is not some class field trip. Miss Wycliffe is a child herself. She doesn't belong there. We can't do our job if we have to be watching her, too." "I'm sure something could be arranged," assured Madame Pomfrey. "Perhaps," conceded Mr. Tuttle, "but it is not a good idea. One word at the wrong time, a single slip-up, and it'll all be ruined. You want to make sure Meg is okay?" He addressed Holly directly. "Then let us do our job, and you stay here. I'll tell you what happens later." He turned again to Madame Pomfrey. "I doubt she'll be permitted off campus even if I wanted to let her come, which I don't." "We can still ask," insisted Madame Pomfrey, noting the tears brimming in Holly's eyes. "I know there must be a way." Harry Potter knelt next to Holly behind some small bushes. They both wore a disillusionment charm. It caused them to blend in with the background, becoming kind of human chameleons. But if they moved, they still ran the risk of being noticed. The charm did not protect against sound either. Using his wand, Harry had cast a muffliato spell, just in case. Mr. Tuttle warned emphatically they could neither be seen nor heard while in the woods. They could not interfere in any way. Mr. Tuttle had not been pleased at their presence while he engineered Meg's return, but it was something he could not avoid. At first, Headmistress McGonagall had been reluctant to give consent to Holly witnessing Meg's return, but Healer Winonan sent an owl and emphatically urged the contrary. Madame Pomfrey had written him concerning the situation. Winonan said that inexperienced empaths ran the risk of merging too intensely with the emotions of another. The kind of separation from Meg that Mr. Tuttle intended could cause irreparable damage to Holly's mental state and her empathic abilities. Harry volunteered to chaperone Holly as soon as he learned she wanted to be present at Meg's return. Madame Pomfrey sent him an owl, too. In face of Healer Winonan's medical advice and Harry's offer to supervise, Mr. Tuttle had been unable to find a reason to refuse. Sometimes, mused Harry to himself, it's useful to be a hero, especially one on good terms with a minister of magic. Just before sunrise, Harry and Holly had watched quietly while Mr. Tuttle laid Meg gently down on a carpet of leaves underneath a tree. Abruptly, Mr. Tuttle vanished with a loud crack, leaving the two alone in the woods with Meg. Then they waited. Meg stirred restlessly on the leaves. Holly shivered. "She's cold," she told Harry. "Very cold." Harry put his robe over Holly's shoulders. "The sun will be up soon to warm her," he told Holly reassuringly. The first rays of sun shone on Meg. After a while she stirred some more. "She's warming up," whispered Holly. Then later, Holly said with urgency, "She's starting to wake. Where are they?" "They'll be here," said Harry confidently. "Be patient." He scanned the area anxiously, hoping someone would come soon. Meg opened her eyes and looked about. Holly's eyes glazed over, lost in the emotions she felt. "What's happening?" Holly whispered. "Where am I?" Meg struggled to her feet. Holly started to stand, too. Harry had to hold Holly in place. "Keep still," he whispered to her urgently, but he doubted Holly had heard him. She and Meg did seem to be as one with their emotions. Healer Winonan had sent Harry a separate message by owl, saying that Holly's intense time unblocked with Meg had left her particularly vulnerable to strong emotions. If Holly couldn't successfully separate her own emotions from Meg's, then Harry was to bring her to St. Mungo's immediately. Harry hadn't thought that would be a problem. But now... "I'm so scared," whispered Holly, while Meg turned around looking with wide eyes. "So very scared." Harry held Holly in place, and she clung to him. He could feel the tears streaming down her face. Suddenly a twig snapped. There came the sound of crunching dry leaves. "No!" whispered Holly, the terror unmistakable in her voice. "Hide!" Holly struggled in Harry's arms while Meg turned and moved away from the direction of the sound. Meg stumbled and fell. Holly continued to struggle frantically. "Meg?" came a voice, a woman's voice. Last night Holly had insisted they find a woman to rescue Meg, as Meg might confuse a man's voice with that of the kidnapper. "Is that you?" asked the voice. Both Holly and Meg froze. Harry turned his head to look. A tall, elderly lady with short blonde hair, wearing blue jeans and a bright red kerchief, had come into view. "Oh my, it is!" said the lady excitedly. She moved forward swiftly before Meg could react and swept her up in a hug. Holly was trembling. "Oh, Meg, honey," the lady crooned while she rocked Meg. "Don't be afraid. I'm a friend." Gradually, Holly began to relax. Meanwhile, the lady reached into her pocket and pulled out a phone. She flipped it open and dialed. "She's here," the lady said excitedly. "She's alive. I've got her. I'm bringing her back." The lady picked Meg up and started walking back the way she had come. Meg, honey, she said while she walked, I'm so glad we found you. Everyone's been looking for you. Your mum's been so worried. Harry released Holly. He took her by the hand and stood up. They waited until Meg and the lady vanished from sight, and then the two followed along. Harry pulled Holly to a stop when they heard sounds of yells and shouts. He and Holly circled around until they had a view of the road with cars parked alongside. The lady and Meg were in the center of a small crowd of people, all cheering and laughing. She's scared, whispered Holly. The noise is too much. Not for long, whispered Harry back. Look. More cars had driven up. From one came a short, middle-aged lady with brown hair. She rushed into the center of people and took Meg from the lady with the red kerchief and hugged the child tightly. That must be her mum, said Holly with a lightness in her voice. Meg is happy, truly happy. She was always so sad with me. They stood together silently, watching the scene before them. More cars arrived, more people, an ambulance. Harry felt Holly's tug on his hand. Are you ready to go? He asked her. Yes, sir, she answered. How do you feel? He asked, wondering if the two still shared the same emotions. Kinda sad, replied Holly. She's happy, and I'm happy for her. But she's not going to remember me, will she? No, replied Harry quietly. He was relieved that Holly and Meg were no longer as one emotionally. I think she would find being back with her family a good trade, don't you? I suppose. Harry led Holly back into the woods away from the people. They no longer needed to worry about being quiet. The Muggles were far too loud on their own to notice them. Will she be okay? Holly asked as they walked. I think so, replied Harry. But they never found the kidnapper. True, agreed Harry. However, the wizards have laid some protection spells and anti-stranger hexes around Meg's house, which should keep her safe. Holly stopped suddenly. Nightmares, she said anxiously. She'll be scared of sleeping like I was. I've been thinking about that, replied Harry. If an anonymous well-wisher should make a gift of a small kitten to keep Meg company at night, I don't think the parents could turn it down, do you? Holly laughed. No, sir, I don't think they could. I know of a small place in Diagon Alley that has an excellent selection of cats and kittens, said Harry conversationally. Would you like to help me pick one out? I would indeed.